All right. I think we're live, and I'll wait a few seconds for people to trickle in, my amazing subscribers and occasionally random people who might wander in. I always, I'm always interested by the analytics. I did a look at the analytics, the internal numbers on my channel. It's interesting the people who are watching from abroad. Yes, he is. Hi, Bobby. It's good to have you here. And there's a list of countries. I think I know. I have a subscriber from who's in Saudi Arabia. I think there are also there are a couple of German subs, and it's always interesting to see where people are watching from. I was actually gonna make a video about Hatun, about, and it's really amazing. She's been doing interviews. She's actually been doing press since her attempted assassination by a Muslim in Speaker's Corner. Not only that, I think she's actually returned to Speaker's Corner to preach. Because I saw, and I didn't watch the actual video, but there's a video on Fander Films with Jay Smith, the great Christian apologist and street preacher, whose ministry is to Muslims over there. Hi, GW. Whose ministry is to Muslims, and he is probably the most famous, up until Hatun, he was the most famous Christian street preacher at Speaker's Corner. He actually started this initiative since freedom of speech is so constrained in the United Kingdom. The only place where you can really speak up against something like Islam, which is more or less a protected class in that country, the only place you can do that is in Speaker's Corner. And he started this initiative to actually go there and preach the gospel to Muslims while exposing the internal contradictions, the hypocrisies, and the ultimate futility of Islam in believing in Muhammad and following Allah. And he's attracted a lot of attention. And Hatun was his disciple, a former Muslim who got saved and then started preaching against Islam and preaching over there. Of course, she's been attacked repeatedly. Again, just to reiterate, none of her attackers have been apprehended, let alone prosecuted. It's even worse than the Muslim grooming gangs, the child rape gangs. Some, a, a very minuscule amount out of the tens of thousands of Muslims that have been involved in child grooming gangs, there have only been a handful of prosecutions, but at least they prosecuted some of the child rapists. Um, in her case, they haven't prosecuted or detained anyone, despite the fact that there have been multiple attempts on her life. But hey, Richard. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the vaccine passport rollout in New York City. And I gotta tell you, I just have to preface this by saying, listening to, I had never actually listened to one of our esteemed mayor's press conferences, but having to listen to a half hour, I didn't watch the entire presser, fortunately, but even listening to a half hour of this man and some of the half-wits that populate the city council here, particularly the chairman of the health committee, Mark Levine, is infuriating. It's really, you go away from it befuddled and sort of astonished that people like this can be elected, and then you realize what comprises the New York City electorate, especially now that a huge portion of the sane voters have fled, have basically left the city, have moved below the Mason-Dixon line, or some of them are still living in New Jersey. Others have moved out to the Midwest. But what remains is a group that elects people like Bill de Blasio and Mark Levine and Adriano Espaillat, who's a Dominican congressman that replaced Charlie Rangel. Charlie, uh, the notoriously corrupt congressman from Harlem who came from the Percy Sutton machine, and replaced the other notoriously corrupt Adam Clayton Powell Jr. I'll see about that. Just focusing on this, it was mystifying. And the fact that these people are elected officials until you realize who the electorate is. But basically, it was a half hour after explaining some of the technical details. There was a half hour of him justifying this royal decree that forces businesses to sort of to become hall monitors, to ensure that you've been coerced into being vaccinated, and you have this passport, this vaccine passport. It's very similar to what Emmanuel Macron did, and I'm not surprised that New York City was the first city to initiate this. And there are a number of observations. One of them, which I don't think is getting enough, is drawing enough attention, is the fact that this is another government man. It essentially creates a cohort of useless workers. It creates artificial jobs that wouldn't otherwise exist. In this case, they're going to these restaurants, and I think one of the reasons it was rolled out during the summer is because this gives them some leeway. The people who do not want to be coercively jabbed, they can still eat outside, and they won't have to deal with the consumer backlash. So instituting it now bypasses that initial resistance and delays it up until October. So 2.5 months from now, when they assume it'll be a fait accompli, people will simply comply. This way, they don't face that initial wave of resistance, at least at the restaurants, and just creating an incident. But it's essentially for the future, assuming this is enacted, and there's no reason to believe that they're going to back down from this absent massive non-compliance. It creates a position where these restaurants have to hire a bouncer, because they're not going to give this job to a host or hostess, the person you greet upon entering a restaurant. You're going to have restaurants that are not nightclubs, not banks. You're going to have restaurants, normal restaurants in comparatively safe neighborhoods, They're going to have to hire bouncers. Even restaurants that don't serve alcohol, that don't have liquor licenses, they're going to have to hire a bouncer, a person who's going to physically enforce this edict. And I don't think people have thought. I don't think people have thought about this enough. The consequences of this. So it's going to create a whole class of employees that, absent this decree, would not exist. Now, if you support this kind of thing, you're already a believer in statolatry, and that's an inducement that you actually probably believe in Keynesianism. You think the government should prime the pump, so to speak, and do this and just create uh, scores of completely useless jobs that wouldn't exist without the diktats of the government. So you're going to have the same way you have diversity and inclusion departments in most corporations now, and you had HR, human resources departments, from the 70s up until relatively recently. You're going to have a collection of people who are there as physical enforcers of this totalitarian government edict. And I don't think that's garnered enough discussion, to be honest. I haven't seen that many people mentioning it. The fact that after a year of the government deliberately crushing, particularly small business, uh, the ones that they haven't already wiped out, and there are thousands in New York City alone that have been destroyed through the actions of the government over the past year and a half. Those that still persisted, that still somehow managed to survive, they're going to be once again forced to take on more water than they already have, as a result of this decree. So that's one of the emphasized portions of this. More generally, and I think people have been talking about this a lot, is the and Mayor de Blasio. This was one of the key sound bites from his conference. They broadcast this all over the news. It was probably the main 10 to 15-second soundbite that was that was focused on by the local news media and maybe the national news media as well. I only read a few. I didn't read that much national cover of this, aside from a Fox News article on their website. But the main emphasis was on this tiny soundbite where he said, we've tried." Essentially, he repeated the typical mobster mantra. Well, this is we tried being nice with you, but you wouldn't comply, so we're going to be not so nice in the future. And and he said, we've tried all of these voluntary measures. We've been as patient as humanly possible, but that didn't work. Start rolling out the big guns, and you're going to do what we want. and the main line was, well, if you want to participate in our society, where, and I'm paraphrasing here, he basically said, if you want to participate in this great society we have going in New York City, where where your property is seized, where you and this dovetails a little bit with the rent, the government edict, basically saying that you can not pay your landlord. But basically, if you want to enjoy this great society where your property is seized, where the police are under no obligation to protect your life or your property, where you're brutalized by criminals who've been released from prison, uh, 80 to 90 times. If you want to enjoy this great society we have in New York, you're going to have to get the jab. There's no other option. And the thing is, my response would be, I don't have affection for this society. And I'm in New York City. I mean, yes, in the past, I've enjoyed theatrical productions. I loved going to Shakespeare in the Park, and I used to go to Broadway and off-Broadway plays. I'm I'm a big fan of theater in general, as well as museums. The Frick collection, which is closed, by the way, it's permanently closed. So, um, the Frick collection was one of my favorite museums, as well as the Cloisters, the Met in general is a fantastic museum. But I'm not under any delusion. I'm not going to sacrifice my freedom, my liberty to go to an art museum, even if it's a even if it's a world-renowned art museum. It's not that important to me. It's not that vital. These few things that New York City offers that might be absent, and the past year was a great illustration of how false this promises. This appeal of New York City is, well, you now that the Giuliani era has passed, you're going to be subjected to violent criminals who will not be brought to justice. You're going to have to experience pollution and litter and inhale exhaust fumes and the noise, the ear-splitting noise of New York City. You're going to experience that, but you get all of these amenities that are absent from other all of these podunk cities in the Midwest or below the Mason-Dixon line. And last year was an illustration of how illusory this promise is when all of these things vanished. So you're experiencing everything New York City has to offer, which without those things is uniformly negative, and you're not enjoying any of those supposed benefits that accrue to you from living in the ostensible global capital of commerce and entertainment and art and fashion. You're not experiencing any of that. So why wouldn't you live in a place like South Dakota? Okay, it might not have the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but most places don't have that. Just like most places don't have the Louvre or the Hermitage in Russia or the Prado. It's not that big of an enticement, to be honest. So his De Blasio's that was De Blasio's mantra. If you want to enjoy this great society, you're going to have to comply. And my initial response would be, I don't enjoy participating in this society. I don't like a New York society. I don't think that this is something that's to be. And the few things, again, the few things that are cited, these artistic cultural institutions, they're not worth the trade-off. So I mean, no, I don't want to be part of this society, but that doesn't mean I should be forced to. I should be forcibly inoculated against a disease that I'm unlikely to get. So yes, that's not an enticement. Oh, I want to be part of New York City. I can to be outside and have hunger pangs. I don't want to be forced to wait 2 hours or 2.5 hours in order to ingest food. And I don't want to have fields of work foreclosed to me because I happen to live in New York City. And hey, Scott. So that sort of reasoning is completely it's it's specious to put it bluntly. It does not have any persuasive power, at least for people who've contemplated this issue. And I think the problem is de Blasio is a collectivist like many most, I would even dare to say the majority of New Yorkers. They don't understand that not everyone buys into this idea of a civil contract. In other words, you're subjected to the whims of whatever government happens to be in office at the time, and is even if it was instituted by people who you vehemently disagree with and who voted against your interests by virtue of the fact that you live in a quote unquote democracy. So your rights are subject to curtailment, even abolition, if a majority of the voters, or even simply a plurality of the voters that within that polity decide that your rights need to be abolished or circumscribed in some way. So you're subject to that, even though you didn't vote for it, you didn't sign on or agree to that. You're subject to that by virtue of the fact that you're part of that society. And I think this goes back in some sense. Thomas DiLorenzo has written about this. It goes back in some sense to the Civil War, where people confused the Union of States with the federal government. So and they sort of conflated these two into that point. So this idea that you need that you're essentially a subject. You're not at that point. You're not really you're not really an independent, sovereign individual. You have forfeited your right to exercise, in this case, bodily autonomy. That's the thing. Yeah, they're taking the vaccine out of guilt. A lot of people are actually taking it out of obligation. They feel, again, this is something in order to travel, in order to not be fired. Over 100 nurses in Houston were fired from their job for not taking the vaccine. And the thing is, you could say this was a private entity, but what's happening in New York has nothing to do with individual businesses exercising their rights. And this whole argument is a joke anyway, because do businesses have the right to discriminate for other reasons? No, they don't. The government has taken that right away from them. So it's crazy. It's completely and utterly insane. And it's hard to going back to this idea of being part of a society and signing on to this so-called civil contract, which is an artifice. It's a fictitious creation in order to justify any abuse that the government deems necessary. So when you say you can't exercise even bodily autonomy, you can't decide what to do with your own body, at that point you're not a sovereign individual. You're not really a citizen. You're a subject. And the irony is you have less rights than you would if you were the subject of a monarchy or or the crown, which is an institution that progressives generally despise and think it and pour contempt upon because it's supposedly undemocratic. So you can't exercise bodily autonomy. And the thing is, of that society, as I said, I don't want to be part of that society. When you have people, when you have people, when you have an issue that cuts to the heart of human rights and individual freedom like this, you can't. There's no compromise. You have when someone says that there's no limit on what the state can do to when someone says essentially your body, your life, and your property is subject to the whims of the state, that point of view, there's no reconciliation between that perspective and the perspective of someone who extols their own individual liberty and autonomy above the decrees of of government. Yeah, Manhattan is the epicenter of insanity. It's also, not surprisingly, it's the most it's right. So I forget the exact figure, but I think it's close to three-quarters of the borough has been vaccinated, and it's not surprising when you encounter the typical Manhattan voter. I mean, these are people that have never, a lot of them have never exercised an independent thought in their lives. They're people that simply regurgitate whatever they've seen from their trusted quote unquote news sources, like the New York Times. The New York Times is the Bible for people that live in Manhattan. It's their, they believe that the New York Times is inerrant, it's infallible. It's their version of scripture. And one of the co-hosts from the British YouTube channel Trigonometry had an amazing Twitter thread that tackled this subject the other day, and he he tried to explain to these type of people why there is vaccine hesitancy or vaccine resistance among the general public, because to these people, trust the CDC or the pronouncements of Anthony Fauci is not only it's heresy, but it's unfathomable. They don't understand. They think that if you don't trust these sources, then you're literally insane. And and he had a thread which basically point by point explained why there would be hesitancy. And he goes down, he runs down the list and he says, well, imagine this is 2016 and you've been told that Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president, and there's a 99% chance that Hillary Clinton is going to be the next president. It's almost a certainty that she'll be elected. Brexit has no chance of passing, and we shouldn't even be concerned about it passing because it's such a remote possibility. And then speed it up to the year of the COVID. Say the same sources are saying that it's impossible to go outside because you'll kill. Have literal riots where people are in close contact with each other, and these are being endorsed by the same. It's endorsed by the same state media and uh, collection of elite opinion givers. And he just goes point by point, and he's demonstrating you believed all of these things as the truth, as the inerrant truth. And look at what happened. And he goes through Russiagate as well, all of the lies that were propagated by Russiagate. He says, you've experienced all this, and yet you're still curious. You still wonder why people may be hesitant to be jabbed, and it's worth checking out that particular Twitter thread. I forget the name of I don't remember the name of the host, but it was one of the guys co-hosts from Trigonometry. De Blasio is not up for re-election. He actually, they've already decided who the candidates are going to be on the Republican and Democratic side, and the Democratic nominee is Eric, who's basically a police bureaucrat and then a government bureaucrat. I don't think he's ever held a private. He's never had a private job in his entire life, to the best of my knowledge, and that includes, being a paper boy or cutting grass as a teenager. But yeah, so Adams is the presumptive mayor because although I mean it would be kind of interesting if Curtis Sliwa won. It would probably be the biggest political upset in American electoral history, although I don't see that. That's very highly unlikely, but it would be great just to see what would happen. What would happen if that occurred? So yeah, Adams is the presumptive mayor, and De Blasio, I don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he issued this as a lame duck is just an illustration of the contempt he has for, well, basically everyone but himself and his graft-happy wife, Charlene. So Cuomo, technically, he can run for re-election, although it looks like the knives are out for him. I think he might try to gut this out, but when the entire hierarchy of the Democratic Party, it's kind of like the mob. It's like the Gambino crime family. If there's a capo, look at me pontificating as if I'm intimately familiar with organized crime. This is this is what watching too many Michael Francese videos does for you. But if you're a capo in the Gambino crime family and the Don and the consigliere and everyone else wants you out, you can try to gut it out, but chances are you're not going to make it. And the Democratic Party is sort of like a mafia family. When the president and the speaker and all these people want you gone, I find it highly unlikely that Cuomo is going to survive. I mean, at the most, he might be able to finish out his term, but I doubt they'll allow him to run for re-election. Although I could be wrong. This is 2021. Stranger things have happened. But just to sum up, I would encourage anyone who's listening to go and read Lysander Spooner, his thoughts on the difference between the government and the highwaymen. And he says both basically offer you the choice of your money or your life. The difference is the highwayman has no pretense to moral authority. When someone robs you, when someone puts a gun to your head and asks you to forfeit your property or your money, or you're going to be murdered, they don't do it under the auspices of a moral virtue. And this is what the state does. It might be, and there was an interesting John Harris from Conversations That Matter had a great link the other day on his community page to a video by a Southern historian who basically he had a video explaining how the Puritans messed up America, and he was a little too harsh on them. But I think the salient point was the sort of idea of imposing virtue the the has been a part of the United States for centuries, and this is something that was inherited by the the progressives and the progressive left. So, you know, Calvinist or Reformed preachers who, and you can kind of see the transition into people like Henry Ward Beecher, but it was a pretty interesting video. I don't think it'll be overturned in court, but I think it's very hard to say. I really don't know. The best, probably the best option right now is for it to be withdrawn, but you would have to have massive non-compliance. You would have to have resistance from businesses, and I'm not sure that's going to happen. Again, this is all speculation. We don't. It's not going to be. They're not going to start to enforce this into mid-September, so we might know a little more by then. But there was actually a Vox article, naturally released a couple of days ago, which made the argument that yes, it's constitutional for states and municipalities to enforce mandatory vaccines, and we're not sure if it's constitutional at a federal level, but they should do it. So that is the sort of mentality you're dealing with. That's but anyway, it's almost going on 40 minutes, so I think I'll wrap up. I just wanted to give my thoughts while they were fresh on this issue. Thanks, Richard, Scott, GW, Alejandro. I'm sorry I didn't say hi to you, Bob, and anyone else who's lurking or watching. And I will see you next time.